Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy.
This is episode number 122, Avoiding the Disintegration of Your Marriage and Your Family.
Well, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that most people who are married, maybe not most, but a lot of people think that they have a great marriage and they're just kind of apathetic about the fact that it could be destroyed or disintegrated?
I think so. I think this is something that's not, if there are not like major problems that you're confronting, then you might think, oh, we're good, we're fine.
I think a lot of people who are, especially people who are religious and those that go to church and both feel like they're on the same page with their families and kids, I think a lot of people that are in that boat, who are part of a traditional family, I think those people are probably feeling pretty good.
Yeah. And I think that as we think about, what is going on with marriages and families as a whole and the attack on marriage and families, if we're doing okay, then we might not think, hey, I could be a victim of what's going on, and we may fall prey to what's going on out in the world. Again, if there's like maybe not one of these major struggles that's taking place. But I think the trap is that we could become very comfortable and not proactive about what we could do to actually strengthen our marriage so that we are not becoming the prey to the world, and that we can actually become an awesome force to combat what is going on outside, out in the world that is really pulling families apart and individuals on such a high level that we are seeing levels of depression and suicidal ideation at an all-time high.
You say become an awesome force.
Yes.
And when I think about the statistics and the evidence of the disintegration of marriage and family, it's obvious what's happening. Every year, divorce rates climb higher. One of the things that I feel strongly about is that people who are married and do have a great family, we need you.
Yes.
Like, the institution of marriage needs you to be even stronger and to believe even deeper in what you already have, because a lot of people, far too many, get deceived in thinking that things are all good, and they're not as good as they think because they're not actually working on it. They're lulled into security of, the fact that their husband doesn't cheat on them or the wife doesn't cheat on them, and they have enough money to, take care of their needs.
Well, I find something very interesting. When I work with a client and we talk about some of our priorities and values that we actually have, usually they will say their marriage is a top priority. But then if you take a step further and say, okay, if marriage is a top priority for you, how much time are you actually spending being proactive in your marriage, working on it in a positive way? Not just like dealing with it or struggling through it or just maintaining, but actually doing those positive things that help that healthy relationship continue and maybe even flourish more. And what we find is that it's usually zero.
Yeah.
It's zero amount of our time. And so when I work with a client and we bring this to light, it's usually very surprising and astonishing because they realize, hey, this is a big priority for me, but I'm not spending any time on it. And they don't mean to do that. It's not on purpose. It's usually just by default because we're so busy and this world teaches us to be very busy. And we think that that's a valuable thing.
Yeah, getting back to the clients, when we talk to people, whether their clients are just friends or whoever, right? Most of the people that have good marriages really just muscle through it. They're just like, hey, if nothing's wrong, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Mm-hmm.
But what we don't understand is that it's such a complicated thing when you have two individuals in a marriage and the dynamics of that. It's so easy for something to go wrong. And it's so easy to miss something along the way because everything seems good, but it's not as good as you think. And then you bring children into the picture. Yeah, here's a question for you. Do your children know that you're in love?
Awesome question.
Do they just assume you are, or do they know? Do they see through your actions and through your words and through the way that you work through problems and interact with each other and communicate? Do they know that you're in love?
I think that's such a good question, and one that could be really underestimated, right? Because we may think, again, if there are no major problems, that our kids probably aren't thinking much about it. But our kids think.
Yeah, they do.
They observe, they wonder, they question. Our children's brains are on full mode of development. That means that they are very interested in absorbing new information. And so what are they absorbing as they watch and witness our relationship, the husband and wife relationship, and the interactions that take place? I also think it's important to ask this question when it comes to the children, like, how do they see us navigating the challenges of marriage? Do they see us yelling and throwing plates when we're upset? Or did they see us taking a time out for ourselves to sit down, to calm down and say, hey, we're going to talk through these things. I just need a few minutes to gather my thoughts. And do they see us having discussions even when we disagree rather than, just yelling and arguing? Do they see us using awesome communication skills? Do they see us saying sorry? If they don't see any of those things, they don't know to do them themselves.
They don't know to do them. And also they're being taught in school at the same time. And, some states are better than others, some counties better than others, right? Depending on where you live. But they're going to school being taught really that marriage is not important.
Yeah.
They're not being taught that marriage and family is key to society. They're being taught that they should discover their own truth and that they should be able to do what they want. In some places, they're being taught that they should be able to choose which gender they are, right? That they should choose their sexuality. And when they're being taught that as young as, 5 or maybe sometimes younger, sometimes a little older, but when they're being taught these things before their brain actually develops and they can actually think about the consequences of that and what you actually have, what you're up against with your children and teaching them that marriage is important.
Yeah. You
really do nowadays have an extra duty and urgency to show your children, not just teach them, right? Because if you're just saying words to them, those words are being opposed in school or by their friends or in the media. So you can't just teach them. You have to show them why marriage is so awesome and why they should strive for certain goals with family.
Yeah. And I think this has definitely been being brought to my attention a lot in the last, maybe 4 or 5 months, that kids have so much access to YouTube, even at school. And what maybe we don't realize as parents is that a lot of times children will look up something that seems very innocent for a school-related, topic. And before you know it, they're being taught how to argue with their parents and how to win the argument.
Oh, yeah.
And so we have such different layers of battles that we're fighting now that we didn't have 20 years ago, 30 years, 50 years ago. And so it's going to be important that we're also more proactive than we've been in the past with helping not only ourselves navigate this, but our children.
We're going to get to something specific here. I just want to say, one more thing with that. We are literally in a war against the family.
Yeah.
And I think, 10 years ago, people are like, yeah, there's war against the family. Okay, pornography is becoming more prevalent and, men are being deceived and, leaving their families. Well, nowadays you see women doing it just as much as men. But also, when you look at what is happening with the youth and what is being taught our children, this is something that you see through the scriptures from the beginning of time as far as society goes, right? The youth start to fall away from the traditions of their parents. And when that happens, then generations end, right? So we're in danger of the entire family falling apart, even in churches. First of all, we're seeing fewer and fewer people going to church.
Yeah.
And that is the number one problem, is the relationship with God is number one when it comes to family. There's all kinds of scriptural backup for that, but also even societal evidence for that those that are religious have much higher percentage of success in the family.
Yeah.
And then second of all, when we are really looking at the way that we are interacting as husband and wife, there is so much temptation to see the other as holding us back rather than building us up. And that comes from media, that comes from whatever it is that we're watching on YouTube or whatever we're watching on TikTok. And the doubts when they start to come in as to, are you living your best life? Are you living your truth? Right? There's a lot of this kind of language that's coming in, and it's very selfish, and it's very much all about me. And that is the pride of the world, right? The pride of the world is that we are looking at ourselves and getting what we want rather than what is best for us and best for others. And ultimately, that's what gives us what we want. But we're being deceived into thinking that that's not the way that we get there. So there is a war on marriage and a war on the family.
Okay, so we're going to dive into a few things today to help with all of this, right? We're going to talk about a proclamation that was sent out to the world in 1995 called The Family, a proclamation to the world. We're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and this proclamation was sent out to every president in the world, every leader of the world, from our prophet at that time. And it was to remind the world how important the family is to the functioning of the world. And so that we can keep everyone healthy and moving forward and progressing. And also as a strong reminder that this is God's plan for us on the earth, is to be in families. And when this came out in 95, sometimes when we read it, we were like, well, this is so obvious. These things, these points, and this proclamation seemed so obvious. And in just a short amount of time today, you can see why this document is so valuable, because we have taken a strong left turn where now the things that were so obvious in 1995 are totally being questioned and challenged.
Well, it's interesting that even in our church, this proclamation, a lot of people in the church are looking at it like it's old and outdated, and it's hateful because it talks about how important the marriage between a man and woman is. We're not here to judge that, right? We're not here to judge your family or people that you love, because we have the same situation. But the evidence is clear. When it comes to our own families, when our children are being taught certain things about gender and about marriage between a man and a woman, we're going to talk about why it is important that we keep family strong and why we keep marriage promoted between man and a woman, because there is so much evidence spiritually and also in society that keeps our society strong. And there's all kinds of prophecy about why, when we lose sight of that importance and the importance of the way that we have been given certain institutions from God himself, there's reasons for it, right? None of us are perfect. All of us are going to stray from the perfect path. But there are some things that just have such an impact on the world that we have to really take a step back and think about it and think about how we really feel about it. This does not mean that we aren't going to love and support people who stray from this path, but we have to consider, for my family, for me, even though I have, friends and family that do this other thing, why is it important for me to keep my marriage strong and my family strong and to be that awesome force for others to continue this tradition? Because without this tradition, society collapses on itself.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
So true. One thing I wanted to point out before we dive into this is something that you said, is that some people may view traditional marriage as an old concept, or even view this proclamation as something that's old and not relevant. And I just want to point out that most times when prophets declare something that is prophetic, this is a lot of the typical response, like, oh, that's not
yeah.
going to happen. Oh, that's not relevant. And so I think it's important that we also make that distinction, that this is something that is prophetic. It has nothing to do with the times and the ages and whether it's old or current. It has nothing to do with that. It's the fact that it comes from a prophet. And he says, this is going to happen if we start leaving the traditional family values. And also that when someone just categorizes something as hate speech, when you don't really hate somebody, right? I look at, our family members who do struggle with same-sex attraction. If someone were to just say, well, if you don't agree with them and support them, then, you're against them. This is actually very not true. And I think this is an important point, that we have confidence and know what to say, that it's not hate speech. We're not against them, because this is a form of rigid thinking.
Right.
When someone calls you and what you're thinking and what you value and promote for yourself as hate speech, that's a very immature way of thinking. That's how a first grader thinks, because they don't know how to think different. They don't know how to think higher. They don't know how to call on their brain's capabilities to be able to separate that out. But for us, listening, we call on everyone to use their higher thinking abilities, their mature thinking abilities, not their reactional, not their emotional, the logical part of our brain that can separate that out. And so we call on everyone to do that moving forward, so that we can have better conversations where there's true understanding, true compassion. There's not all this name calling and, what people say is hate speech. We don't need to have any of that. It's actually all irrelevant if you can use your higher thinking skills.
Well, some of the things that people say are hateful. Even some people that believe the things that we believe might have rigid thinking and just think that people who don't live this way are evil and bad. There's a difference between thinking that a practice is evil and the impact that it has on society is evil, versus thinking that individual is evil and judging them, right? So this is something that what you're talking about is this higher brain, this adult thinking, really is critical thinking. Yeah. And the self-coaching model that we talk about all the time, that Shelley teaches in her courses, and you can find those on our website at shelley.andersoncoaching.com. But we are promoting a higher level of thinking critically, and understanding that the thoughts that you have impact the way that you feel, and the thoughts that you have impact the way that you feel and the way that you impact other people as well.
Yes.
And so is it going to be helpful for you to just be a rigid thinker and saying, well, this is the way that God created it and planned it, and so we're going to destroy everybody who disagrees with us? Well, that's not going to get you anywhere. Right? There was an apostle named Neil A. Maxwell. When he talked about politics, when he talked about these things, he said, look, the only way we get anything done is in the middle, right? We have to compromise to some degree. And you have to think through these things and be very careful in what you say, and what you actually believe is a product of the way that you think. Use your higher thinking, right? Use your higher brain and your adult brain, and don't think like a first grader. Open your mind and understand why you believe the things that you believe. And then you will have a much deeper understanding and a deeper conviction about what you believe.
Yes, so true. And so as we move forward, I think it will also be good to keep in mind that when you promote wonderful values, scientifically based values about the traditional family, that we can have confidence in this, and that we can still show all kinds of love and compassion to everyone and anyone, and it doesn't mean something negative. So at the beginning of this proclamation, I just want to start off with just kind of almost the first sentence here. And it says that we solemnly proclaim that marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, and that the family is central to the Creator's plan for the eternal destiny of his children. So as I was reading through this proclamation, this first sentence really stood out to me, because this is where the world is taking a left turn, right? Instead of saying, what is God's desire for his children on the earth, we are kind of abandoning that. The world is abandoning what God's desire is for us. And so if marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, the world is starting to tell us something different.
Yeah.
There's now a worldly point of view about what marriage is defined as and what marriage should be, and moving away from what God has actually ordained as the marriage between a man and a woman. And how this proclamation also says that the family is central to the Creator's plan. We're, again, moving away from that and saying, I don't know if I'm interested in the Creator's plan. I think I'm just interested in my own plan. And here's the problem with that. The Creator's plan is a perfect plan because God and his Son, they have all knowledge. They are omniscient. Humans are not. And so if we start making plans according to what we think is the best, and it is completely opposite of the Creator's plan, we're going to end up all over the place. And we're going to wonder why we still aren't feeling happy. We're still have division within ourselves and, feeling depressed and suicidal, is because we are not aligning ourselves and thinking about things and challenging what the world says. We're not aligning ourselves with the main plan, God's plan, which is perfect.
Well, people nowadays think that they're smarter than God.
Yes.
And even Isaiah talks about this. We read in Isaiah that he says, we think our ways are, he's talking about how we think that our ways are better, but he says God's ways are not the same as our ways. We have this processing happening, and it's very limited. God knows all things, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. So why do we think that we're so much smarter than him? And look, we're talking to people mostly that listen to this podcast that understand what we're saying and believe this. But we also still do the same thing. Even though we don't believe that we're smarter than God, we act like we are sometimes, especially in marriage, right? Sometimes we have a hard time forgiving. Sometimes we have a hard time getting along with our spouse or blaming them for something that, they're doing that is a direct relationship to the way God created them. There are a lot of things that we still do in our marriages. And, you talk a lot about this when it comes to intimacy. And intimacy may be, non-sexual and sexual intimacy may be the way that we see this the most. Mm-hmm. Because God has an intention of us being intimate and close and connected. But oftentimes, even in marriages that are mediocre or even good marriages, there's still a lot of that happening where we refuse to get past our blame and get past our rigid thinking and the things that we see in our spouse that cause us to, maybe to not want to be with them or connected to them.
And I think it's important that we talk about the hard things and recognize them for what they are with all the love and compassion. But there are two different types of marriages being promoted in today's world, or one that's being promoted and one that's kind of going by the wayside. And that's why we need strong marriages to continue to step forward and strive and strengthen and be those marriage warriors, because we need it. And what we don't understand and what is so missed is that when we make a commitment to something and then we work to keep that commitment, that self-mastery, that self-progression, going through that hard crap, our self-confidence increases. This is what is being missed completely in today's world. So if we enter relationships with hardly any commitment, we can leave when we want, we can be with as many people as we want, that's living the best life. No wonder this rising generation has zero confidence. This is where self-esteem is taking a nosedive. Our self-esteem and our self-confidence comes when we have a commitment. We go through the process of struggling to reach that commitment. And if our youth aren't seeing this through our efforts and they're not being taught this, where is their self-esteem and self-confidence coming from? It is not there. And that is what we're seeing. This is why so many of our youth are just tanking in their self-esteem right now and feeling major depression and suicidal thoughts. So I do feel a high level of concern for not only couples in their marriage, but also children when they are not being taught that marriage and those commitments to one another is important or valuable, where their self-worth and where their self-esteem is going to go and where it may come from. And I think that's where we're seeing so many of the problems in our youth.
Can I say something too about men and women, but I'm a man, so I'm going to speak from a man's perspective. There are plenty of men that have committed to staying married to one woman. And even though they're not living in a way that maybe there's no infidelity happening, they're being faithful, but they're also living in this world that's teaching them over and over and over again that there's more to life than just one woman. And so to deal with that contradiction and that stress and that struggle within, that's something that men have to deal with in this world. And if they're not actively working on the relationship with their wife and finding the good and the joy and being married to this one person and doing the work that's necessary to see that it's much better to be married to this person, and there's so much to this person that I'm missing out on if I don't work on it, because they're being taught that person's boring and getting old and they don't want to be intimate with you anymore, and they're this hag that is, just there to help keep the family going. And then as a man, you're trying to find other things to overcome that part of you that's missing. And so what that might look like is it might end up leading to infidelity, but also might lead to other things, right? Like any kind of a hobby or something that takes you away from the family, because they're trying to reconcile that in themselves. So even though there are men who are married and have that sense of fidelity, they're still struggling with the things that the world's teaching them.
Yeah, because it's constant.
It's constant.
It's just, there's a bombardment that is taking place. Well, the final point that I wanted to just make about these two different types of marriages is that when you're really striving to have a God-ordained marriage, you're being called on to use your thinking skills. The worldly marriages does not call on that very often, right? Especially if they're trying to teach young kids to make these decisions at age 6. I'm sorry, 6-year-olds do not have the capabilities of what an adult brain has. And so in essence, the world is teaching kids to make decisions when they don't even have the ability really to make those types of higher thinking decisions. And so worldly marriages are not calling on humans to use their higher thinking abilities. Now, this is the very thing that makes humans so different from animals, is that we can think so much higher than animals can.
Yeah.
This is the beauty of being human, is that we can think, we can decide and make choices and have agency of where our life is going to go. Animals are run on instinct, how they're programmed to run.
Yeah.
And yes, they do have some thinking abilities, but is nowhere in comparison to humans. And so we have to look at these two different types of marriages and relationships that are being promoted and saying, go with how you feel. We're asking for a disaster.
Yeah. And also the way that human society has been structured has been built around relationships that animals cannot have.
Right.
And so there you have to ask the question, well, why are we being taught to live more animalistic when we have these higher thinking powers, right? So really what you're looking at with technology and with phones and media, et cetera, is our higher levels of thinking are being pushed out, and we're actually being taught to think or not think more like animals.
Yeah.
So we're being dumbed down by design, and that's one of the reasons why you see a disintegration of the family and marriage, because we're not even individually thinking the way that we're supposed to, and thinking on a higher level of what the potential is for me and my wife together to accomplish and to be an awesome force. Well, we're just now surviving, feeling the stress of not living an animalistic life. It's very sad. And I'm not saying that we're all there now, but that's the direction we're heading, right? Entropy is the destruction of matter over time. That is a law in physics. And it's I believe it's the third law of thermodynamics. And that is true for us even in marriage, right? If we're not building, if we're not creating in our marriages, it is disintegrating. You're either moving forward or backward. That's a fact. And that's part of the reason why this family proclamation to the world is so important, because it teaches us that there's so much more to marriage and family than we remember.
Yes. Another line that really stood out to me in the family proclamation to the world is a little bit more than halfway down. So we started off by saying marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, which means it's not ordained of the world. But this other sentence says the family is ordained of God. And again, this is what we're talking about, is like we're also seeing out in the world is being promoted like, don't have kids, right? It's too hard. They're too expensive. Why would you want to raise kids in today's world? Well, kids that are being raised in today's world, they're meant to be raised in today's world. They are resilient, they are compassionate, and they are meant for this exact time. When they grow up this way, they're not comparing it to the 1900s. They didn't grow up in the 1900s. So they're growing up in this environment, and our job as parents is to still continue to teach them God's plan, His values, His ways, not the worldly ways that change like the seasons, that inconsistency.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do? We continue to have spiritual discussions with our children.
Yeah.
And between one another as husband and wife. Do our children see us having spiritual discussions? Do they see us having discussions about the relationship? Do they see us have discussions where we disagree and say, I think differently on that one? What are your thoughts? Well, these are mine. I guess it's okay if we disagree on some things. We can still have respect and a ton of love for one another. Do they see that happening? Our children are actually so hungry and so thirsty for real conversations and about real things. It's amazing if we actually sit down and talk to them, they usually dive in. Yeah. Now, obviously, we have some teenagers that sometimes they're not in the mood to do it. But if you watch, they have their moments when they are in the mood and they are craving it. Are we aware of that? And are we taking advantage of those things when they come up? If our teenage son asks us a question, that means he is ready to hear the answer.
Yeah.
And so we've got to take advantage of that.
I just want to say this too. We haven't been as diligent this year on Come Follow Me, but Come Follow Me is a program that our church implemented a couple years ago, where we reduced the number of hours we actually go to church on Sundays, and we took one of those hours and made it a home study.
Yeah.
And one of the things we found is when we have Come Follow Me, our kids ask these incredible questions, and our conversation might go for a really long time. And it might not be about the gospel subject that we're talking about. It might be about something else, but at least we're having this conversation, and our kids can ask questions, and they learn that we can have discussions.
Yeah.
And they're not just sitting there being told what to think and told what to do. We're teaching them how to critically think. And the self-coaching model that we talk about a lot, again, you can learn about it more on shelly.andersoncoaching.com. In the courses that Shelly teaches, it's amazing because it is all about understanding that we have agency in our thinking, and therefore we have agency in our feelings. And when you understand that, then the whole world opens up.
Yeah.
And now what other people think and feel is interesting, because you now understand that everybody really does have agency. It's not just something we say, it's something that you experience. your own agency and others' agency. It's constant. And we have the ability to do this. And we're not just in bondage to our thoughts. And that is what the world teaches also. Is that, oh, you're just in bondage to whatever you think. And that's a result of your environment and what you were taught as a child. And that's it.
Right.
So I guess my point is, when we are able to teach our children by listening to what they have to say and acknowledging their intelligence, and that when we're willing to learn from them, then they're empowered as a person that has self-worth
Yes.
and self-esteem.
And I also think it gives them such a wonderful opportunity in a safe environment to say, well, I don't understand how that works. What do you mean by that, right? It teaches them it's okay to ask questions and have a discussion, where a lot of times kids, they're afraid of that. They're afraid to ask the questions. They're afraid to get that clarity, but we can create that environment that allows for that.
Yeah.
That gives them so much confidence as well. Okay, number 2, another idea of what we can do about all this, teach them where some of their self-worth and their self-confidence comes from. And that is that it comes in their own progress, not somebody else's progress. It's their progress, which is very different than perfection, right? The scriptures don't ask for us to be our very best every day and be perfect every day. They ask us to progress, to be diligent, to be working on it, to have those goals of moving forward with the full understanding that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to backslide and we're going to slip and have our moments. But to have that goal that we can keep moving forward, we can keep progressing and doing those challenging things. I think in today's society, we've erased the concept of things being difficult. We have forgotten that we need to have grit. We need to say, this is hard and I need to get through it. And I can get through it brilliantly, right?
And knowing that there's value in getting through it.
Yes.
There's a reason why life is hard. That's by design.
And as we align our goals and challenge our goals and say, are these aligned with the most perfect plan and goals, God's, I can work on my thoughts and I can change my thoughts so that if I align my thoughts with God's, I feel different, and therefore it's easier for me to actually follow through with them.
Yeah.
And I think that as we are helping ourselves and helping our children understand that they can do hard things and that there's purpose in doing hard things, that they're going to feel amazing about themselves by doing those hard things. When they themselves think about getting married or are in their marriage and their marriage faces challenging and hard things, they're going to have that confidence that they can work through that as well.
Yeah. So we really need to teach our kids by nurturing them and protecting them, by helping them understand how to think for themselves and how to understand what truth is, right?
Yes.
So they have to find their spiritual truth at some point on their own. They have to have their own testimony. But what we teach them about the fundamentals of what is true and what is not, what is helpful to the world and what is not, showing them evidence as to why certain things aren't good for people, right? Letting evidence-based scientific method type conversations run through your home.
Yeah.
We have, a lot of people say, well, we follow the science, but they don't really follow the science. They just follow what the talking points are. The real science is what has evidence. And there is so much evidence that strong marriages and strong families bring joy to people's lives. And when people forget that, and when societies forget that in history, and even currently, you can look around the country and see where the family's disintegrated more than others. You see a breakdown. You see an increase in homelessness and drug abuse and suicide. These are all factual things. Look at the numbers. Teach your children this.
Yeah.
Help them understand that they can think critically when they're told something at school or by a friend, or, they hear something in the media, right? Have these conversations in a way and trust them with their thinking and their desire to know what is true and what is not. And that will not only strengthen them, but it will strengthen your own marriage as well.
Yes. So that was the third point in how to help combat what is happening in the world and the attack on marriage and families is to use your higher thinking abilities. Use the self-coaching model. It's amazing, and it works in any area, right? It's not just specific to marriage, or it can be used in any topic. And so parents, if you don't know the self-coaching model, it's time to learn it, because that way both you and your spouse can start using it and practicing it frequently and consistently, and so that you can teach it to your children so that they can have that skill. It doesn't benefit them for 1 week. It benefits them for life.
And it'll also help them come to the conclusions that they need to come to when it comes to spirituality.
Yeah.
Right? Even though you're not going to force that, and they need to figure that out on their own, but help them know how to think through things and to experiment on the words of God, right? Because there are plenty of kids leaving Christian homes not wanting to continue that tradition because they're not thinking about the pros and cons.
Yeah.
And they're not looking for the fruit of living a certain way. They're just living the way that they're being told, and that is just to follow, their whims.
Yeah. So I would think we just want to end by bringing up this last sentence of this family proclamation because it's pretty powerful. It says, "We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society." And so that's what we're trying to do. And we call on each of you guys to do that as well, is to find that strength to promote strong marriages and strong families.
And when you go to vote tomorrow, maybe this is the standard of how you vote. It certainly is for us. The people that we vote for are those that promote these principles. And if they're promoting something that hurts the family or hurts marriage, they're not getting my vote. They're just not.
Yeah. Any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
I just think that it's imperative that we take a step back, especially for everybody who thinks everything's all good in the hood. It's not as good as you think it is unless you're really deliberately working on creating an environment in your home where you and your husband are communicating and acknowledging each other's thinking and feelings and understanding intimacy together and really becoming more and more connected. That's number one. And then teaching these things to your children. If you're not doing these things, then you really are kind of just letting luck take over and just hoping things go okay, right? Mm-hmm. We have to be deliberate. And that's what faith is all about too, is we trust God's going to help us, but we have to do our part. And that's why we're here, is to learn how to do that. So I just encourage everybody to be positive about this and to stay very optimistic. If you do the things that you know how to do and you are constantly learning how to do them better, things are going to be great. It doesn't mean you're not going to have hard times, but you're going to know how to get through those hard times much better, and you're going to learn much more from them if you learn these skills.
So true. Well, I hope that throughout this next week, you guys will be able to really reflect on these concepts and that you will have a stronger determination to really put your marriage first and family first, that you will be able to put God's plan first and life coaching skills second.
Yeah.
Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and we hope you will join us again next week.